Welcome to Exploring the Mystical Side of Life with your host, Linda Lang.
Hi, this is Linda Lang from ThoughtChange.com. We are exploring the mystical side of life once again this week. If you enjoy our conversations, you can support this channel by liking, subscribing to the channel, sharing it with a friend. Today, we have C Von Hassett with us. C Von is the editor and publisher of Riot Material magazine. He is also an author and spiritual teacher. Welcome, C Von.
Thank you. Hello, Linda.
It's a real joy to have you here today, C Von, and I'm so curious to explore our topic today because it's something new to me as well. You are a longtime practitioner of Dzogchen.
Dzogchen, and it comes out of the Buddhist tradition, but it actually moves above and beyond Buddhism. So it really is not aligned with any formal religion, but it is a high philosophy that's at the peak of Buddhism, which is, it sounds kind of contradictory, but nobody in Dzogchen speaks to Buddhism as essential to the teachings themselves.
So let's start at the beginning and let's find out exactly what Dzogchen is.
Dzogchen is this amazing practice, and it could be combined with every single meditation, and it could be combined with just going to work and just doing your daily activities. But the teachings themselves are very specific in showing us what our natural state looks like. And this natural state is the awakened state. It's the realized state within each one of us that we as conceptual beings have forgotten about lives ago. And we don't pay it any attention because it doesn't do anything within us. It just kind of lies there in the background. And it is the source of all of our behaviors and all of our thinking and all that. So the Dzogchen teachings say, this is what it is. And here are the series of questions that the master will ask you, that you look inside your own mind as you're meditating and you're saying, yes, yes, no, no. And then the master says in the end, well, that's it. What you're looking at right there is it. And you go, wow, I remember that, because we tend to observe this state when we're like drifting off to sleep, or when we run a marathon, or we're swimming in the pool and we get in that groove. And sometimes when we're meditating, and it's very blissful, it's very peaceful. It has a sense of knowing in and of itself. But again, the thoughts arise and we just move on beyond it, and we don't even think about it ever again. So the teachings familiarize us with this state. And then it's up to us to sit there and observe it and become familiar with it, and then ultimately come to know it.
So this is a state that every person experiences.
Yes, it is the essence of sentience, of consciousness, all of our consciousness.
And nothing that is lying dormant. It's right there accessible to us.
It's just a matter of coming to see it, because the thing is that if nobody's going to point it out to you, and that's the instructions are called the pointing out instructions. If nobody points it out to you, you never really understand or recognize that this is the source. And in the Western world, the Western world builds upon our ego. It wants you to be distracted. It's always pulling you out of yourself. And the Dzogchen teachings, the Tibetans have been mastering this for 1,000 years or more. And it's even beyond that, but they've really honed it down to a specific practice, and it really works. It's an amazing practice. You go in and you have all of your anxiety, you have all of your fears and your depressions, and you're just a confusion. And just practicing this, once you learn to recognize this natural state, all that stuff kind of begins to disappear within that state, and it doesn't come back. It just, because you begin to open up and become a more spacious individual.
How long have you been practicing?
I started practicing in the 90s, early 90s, when I was myself, fraught with all of those anxieties and, confusions, and becoming a father. And, that was like a life-changing moment for me. And I really wanted something to address all that. And somehow I stumbled on the Dzogchen teachings by reading a lot of Buddhist text and getting some teachings from Buddhist masters who themselves oftentimes are Dzogchen practitioners. And I just moved right into it and never turned back, because I recognized right in the moment that that was it. That was the way forward in this life and in all lives to come, that just keep practicing this technique.
How long did it actually take you to really notice a difference for you in your life? Was it that immediate?
Well, for me, because I love to party as well, and I love to go out there and just interact and socialize, and so I was intellectually engaging with these teachings, reading all the text, and then practicing when I could, but then going out and partying, coming back to it a couple of days later. So, a good 10 years of me practicing was gaining an intellectual knowledge. And what I love about the teachings is it says yes to this intellectual approach. All the great masters are in a monastery for decades as well, and they're schooling. They're not necessarily practicing. In fact, they even say you're getting so much schooling that you don't have much time to meditate. So there is a contradiction in the teachings themselves that say yes to the intellectual approach, and I grasped that. I was like, I love this, because philosophically it's brilliant. And then when I stopped drinking and I stopped going out and just really wanted to dedicate my life to this practice and had more time to do it, I went full in. And very soon after that, because I did have an intellectual understanding, so I knew what I was looking for, and I had some experiences of recognizing and resting, but then my mind would take me out. But once I dedicated myself to a daily practice, and even getting up at like 1 a.m. and sitting for an hour or so and dead quiet, it was within a few months that I started to recognize incredible change in me.
Tell us a little bit about the actual practice.
So the actual practice is quite simple. Once you've arrived at the place of you're now receiving the Dzogchen teachings, or you're studying them, and if you get in there and you recognize the state, and really if you're looking at the space around you, there's all these things in space. Our house is in space, our bodies are in space, but the space is around us. What we're looking for in our own mind is this exact same space, which is empty, but it's filled with our awareness. And you're looking at this combination between the two. It doesn't move, it doesn't go anywhere, it doesn't begin, doesn't end. And these things you begin to recognize while you're sitting there in meditation. That is the most formal aspect of this practice, is just recognizing. Then from there, the teachings say rest. And you're resting in meditation. What you want to do is keep that mind stable within this awareness of this place, which is an awareness, being aware of your own awareness, because you don't want the I am C Von. You don't want that I to get in the way of what you're recognizing, because within that state of awareness, there is no I, there is no actual manifest self. There is only awareness and space, and you're stabilizing in this space. The problem is that the mind is habitually wanting to kick you out. So prior to Dzogchen, they have this practice called Shamata training. And Shamata training is like, you find a rock and you just stare at that rock and you stabilize the mind. You learn to steady the mind using a scaffold. You can use your breath, you can use a rock, you can use a statue of anything. So you're training the mind prior to going in to stabilize, so the thoughts aren't continually kicking you out. And so that in itself is, that does take training. That takes, you could do it in a few weeks, but in a few months, you can really be stabilized on a rock. And then you stabilize, you take the rock away and you look at the space in front of you and you just stabilize the mind there. When a thought comes, you recognize it and you get right back on that space. So that's basically the training itself. You stabilize the mind, you recognize the mind, and then you go in and you just relax and you just observe it. And it's beautiful because it's like you're observing something that's utterly magnificent.
How did these teachings get birthed into this world?
Well, the great masters, and they've been saying this for centuries, the great masters say that these teachings are taught in 13 solar systems. And the Earth is one of these blessed systems that are receiving these teachings because humanity is capable of understanding them. For instance, an animal is not necessarily going to be able to go sit down and meditate and observe its own mind, even though an animal has pure sentience as well. Even plants, the Earth is conscious. But humanity has the ability to receive these teachings and turn the awareness back in on himself. So they speak to this as mind teachings, that the transmissions are often mind to mind. And From the conceptual perspective, you can be a bit dubious of this. But when you actually get in and start recognizing your own natural state and begin realizing this state, you really get a sense that it's quite possible to receive teachings through awareness, through space, because you move beyond a place of time and distance and all of these things that limit us to the here and now, and you gain access to a much greater space of awareness and knowing and teachings.
I guess I'm almost looking for the lineage.
The lineage, according to my understanding, begins with the Buddha himself. Buddha sat for many years and just released all of his attachments to the world. And through his own practice, he began to realize his own inner nature. So the teachings are, on the one hand, something you need to be taught. On the other hand, the teachings are actually within you. So it's this kind of duality of sorts, but it's not. The Buddha sat for many, many years, and a lot of these great masters sat for a long, long time, and their own wisdom information came up through them, and they began to understand the nature of things. And this is it. You're becoming to understand the nature of all things, including yourself. So the teachings historically entered the world through the Buddha. You can follow this lineage back from teacher to teacher to teacher, all the way back to the Buddha.
I actually like the idea of mind transmission as teaching because there's less room for distortion, let's say. I've had my own kind of etherical experiences where, some information has popped in and I just like get it so much more than if somebody told it to me and I had to think about it and then had to verbalize it to another person. I mean, there's a lot of room for error that way.
Yes. And what's that telephone game where you speak in one person's ear and by the time it gets back around the circle, it's an entirely different, idea. And this is happening throughout time. Once it goes through one person's mind into another person's mind, it gets turned and turned and turned, and ultimately it's something else. And these teachings, well, they're so simple. The essence of them is like they could speak to them in 3 points. So there's not much room for messing them up, but you can mess it up as a practitioner if you're not checking yourself. If you're allowing your ego to get in the way, then you can really go down the wrong path with these teachings. So it's great to always continue to check your own ego and flattering yourself. And I must be arriving at some sort of awakened state. I'm pretty good now. This could trip you up. You always want to be humble. You always want to be checking yourself, making sure you're not going off on these teachings. But what the teachings do is they hand it over to you. They point it out to you and they say, yours to practice. You could spend years practicing it, or you can go get more teachings. You can go find a great master, get clarity, make sure that you're doing the right thing, and then go back and practice again for another year or two, And so I love that about these teachings, that it gives you the power to really master them, but also become intimate with them and fall in love with them.
You've actually co-written a book on this.
Well, I wrote the book. It's called Entering the Mind. And the book is really a Westerner's perspective, a Western practitioner's perspective on these teachings. I'm also a writer, so I felt that I could bring in contemporary metaphors that would work for the Western ear, the Western thinker, because a lot of the metaphors that I was getting a little frustrated with, or maybe they became a little cliched when you're reading the Tibetan texts, teachers, is they have very traditional metaphors. And when you start seeing that same metaphor over and over and over again through 50, 100 texts, and then you go into the retreat room and you hear the same metaphors, they lose their impact. And the thing about these teachings is you need metaphor to really fully grasp where you're going with it, because by the time you've crossed over into this awareness state, language is done. You don't use language anymore. Like, language does not describe what you're experiencing. So you're dependent on metaphor, and you're dependent on ideas of technique. So the book is very much trying to approach this with a new language of sorts. But also I speak in the book on, before you even go into the mind teachings, you have to get your body right. You have to start eating well, getting it clean. So much of our food is really just poisoned with all kinds of contaminants. So you got to get that out of your body, because that really gets in the way of clear thinking. So, the book is speaking to several things before it actually dives deep into real good practice.
If I get off this call today and I want to go sit and try Dzogchen,
Yes.
I'm going to sit, I'm going to find that peaceful place inside of me, do my best to just be very present without thinking. And then what do I do?
When you go in, you're looking for the mind that is actually not doing anything. So you ask yourself a couple questions. You're like, is what I'm looking at beginning? Is there a beginning to it? Is it going anywhere? Does it have a shape? Does it have a color? Does it have, is there distance between you and it? And to most of these questions, you're going to have, the answer is going to be no. There's no distance. There's no shape. There's no color. It doesn't begin. I'm not seeing an end. And you're doing this through, once your mind is rested and kind of stable. And you're observing this. When you're seeing that the space is very much equivalent to the very space that's outside of you, that's also doing nothing, that has no shape, that has no distance. You couldn't say it begins anywhere, it doesn't end anywhere. Then you're pretty much probably looking at mind in its natural state. And all you need to do at that point is try to just rest in that state and observe it, try to stabilize there. And you'll notice after a minute, it could be longer, but you notice that you begin to deepen in awareness in this state, and it begins to open up a little bit. Then you'll watch thoughts arise and you go, okay, got distracted by thought, pull yourself back and find that space again, ask the same questions. Is it beginning? Is it ending? It's always best to get these instructions firsthand from a master. But if there's no master around, you are your best master. So you can trust, if you're really being honest with yourself and not allowing your ego to get in the way of just pulling you in any other direction, you can do this on your own. And then when you begin to feel good about your practice, you start looking around, where is this? And the book also has a couple of great masters in there that are still teaching today, and you can go get teachings from these guys. And so you're checking yourself with reading the book, with going to the masters, with looking at your own mind, and you got this little nice triangular thing going on. And there you go. You just keep doing it, and you just become, it's like doing yoga. You don't go into yoga and you don't start doing these amazing moves. You go in there by just laying on the mat and pushing yourself, you just little bits at a time, but you'll get there.
Can you talk a little bit about the benefit of actually studying with a master?
Well, the master's never going to send you astray. You're never going to actually lead yourself astray when a master's in your presence. For me, it's been 20 years since I've sat with a master. And when I was really starting to go deep into the teachings, I was going to them at least once a year and spending that rest of that year just practicing and reading what they were talking about. So getting clarity from books, practicing, and then going to a master, and they recalibrate. They just do a little bit of recalibration just through their talking. They just talk to the congregation of sorts, and you're just listening and you're taking notes, and the master will give mind transmissions and the pointing out instructions. And so you're getting officially brought into this lineage that goes all the way back to the Buddha. And it's not a Buddhist lineage, it's the Dzogchen lineage. You're allowing yourself to enter this space that says they sanction you of sorts to practice. But before you even get those sanctioning instructions, you're already practicing, because you're reading these books for people who've already been in there. They're already experiencing this awakened state. And so you're getting clean teachings all the way through anyways.
And so once you make that commitment and you actually practice and you spend time in that state on a daily basis, or almost daily basis, let's say, what kind of shifts can you expect in your life?
I could speak to myself saying I had so much anxiety growing up, and I had a lot of fear growing up. I grew up in Los Angeles in the 70s and 60s, and there was a lot of racial warfare going on. There was tensions within my house and in the neighborhood, and then I was also seeing some dark energy spirits that are hanging out next to my bed every night. So I felt traumatized. And that trauma and that anxiety was with me for 30 years. And, I studied Native American teachings and thought, well, maybe shamanistic teachings, I could cleanse myself through energies of the earth. And I mean, that may have helped, but these teachings, the minute I began to practice and stabilize and then realize, it was within months. It was unbelievable how it all just began. And I didn't even recognize it was disappearing because, it was such a normal part of my chatter inside my own body and mind that I didn't recognize it was leaving me while I was practicing, because I was just practicing and I was doing, I was working around, digging up trees and cutting, like I was out in the desert for a few years. So between being one-on-one with the land and practicing every day, by the time I got back into the city, all of the old triggers were gone. I was like, I would go to parties or go to an art gallery and there was nothing in there anymore. No more anxieties, no more fears, no more, like, oh, I don't want to speak to that person because they bring up all kinds of stuff in me. So it happens on its own, and it happens very quickly.
You lose those triggers and they're like gone.
Yes, because you're not attached to all of the small things in the world anymore. You're now beginning to recognize the actual beauty of the world. And there's really nothing to trigger anxiety. All that is within you. So by opening up the space within yourself, I think Einstein once said, like when somebody asked him about, all these scientists are really, poo-pooing your theories. And Einstein was saying, well, they may shoot the arrows, but there's nowhere for them to land, and ultimately when you open up the space within you, all of the old triggers, there's nowhere inside and anywhere for any of that stuff to trigger anything within you, because now you're becoming more of a spacious individual and your heart is opening up and you're more understanding of things and the compassion is starting to arise in you. And so there's no room for anxiety. It just goes.
Did you find that it also opened the door to either greater understanding, greater awareness, or perhaps even wisdom downloads?
Unbelievable. The wisdom that comes up from within is timeless, ageless. It's of a different realm. And it's truly beyond the smaller, thin layer of what we're doing here on Earth, which is, social media, watching television, going to parties, all these things. It's such a tiny little layer that we kind of interact on. And when you're actually resting within your own innate nature, the wisdom that comes up is timeless, is ageless. It's truly wisdom. And it comes up in small doses, but it doesn't leave you. So those small doses turn into larger doses, and it becomes a mindset where you're looking at the world from a whole different perspective.
If this practice is so powerful, C Von, why was it secretive?
There's a couple reasons, I think, and I'm really kind of putting my own ideas here. I think humanity is evolving very quickly. I think the mind of humanity is evolving quickly because I think everybody has some understanding that there's time is short, that we've really done some damage to this planet, and the planet could at any moment kick us off. We're also doing some foolish things out there in the world, by just trying to destroy one another in so many different ways. And resources are diminishing. And I think humankind is recognizing that we don't have much time left. And so we're now able to receive these very profound teachings, whereas even 100 years ago, the Tibetans were very careful to not share these teachings with anybody who wasn't ready. And the people that they saw were ready were the ones who had been practicing their entire life in the Buddhist tradition. And then the master would recognize in, say, maybe there's 100 or 200 people in their monastery, maybe a handful were ready. So they would grab those students and say, you're ready for these high-end Dzogchen teachings. And so that was part of the Tibetan tradition for well over 1,000 years. Early on, it was one master can only give it to one student in his lifetime, and that one student can only give it to one student in their lifetime. So Then it opened up to small groups of people. And then when the Chinese invaded Tibet, all those great masters were thrown out into the world. A good 15, 20 years before that, the teachings were already bubbling up saying, trouble's coming. When you guys leave, it's time for you to now to give these teachings to whoever wants them. And so the 50s came, Chinese came, and all these teachers were dispersed. They started giving the teachings. There weren't many people ready for them or asking for them, but now it's starting to snowball, and these teachings are becoming quite in demand.
Well, thank you so much for being my guest today. Before we wrap up, C Von, is there anything else that you would really like our listeners to know?
Well, you can get the book at enteringthemind.com. And that also takes you to the magazine Riot Material, where you can look at some great art and see some great writing on art and film and some good music. So, if you love art and you love literature, and if you love to meditate, then enteringthemind.com might be your destination.
Thank you again for being my guest.
Thank you so much, Linda.
And thank you for listening to this week's edition of Exploring the Mystical Side of Life. You will find all of our conversations on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, iTunes. Come visit me at thoughtchange.com. Pick up your copy of Learning to Listen, and we will see you again next time. Bye for now.